Hello, I'm Trevor Rolls. Thank you for joining me. Today we are continuing on in our study of what it means to be in Christ. Last time we discussed what it meant to be a Gentile in the times of the New Testament, and today we're going to explore the topic of what it means to be dead in sin. Now in Ephesians 2, chapter 2, verse 1, Paul writes, "You he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sin." And to provide a little explanation to exactly what he means by dead in trespasses and sin, he goes on in the passage to talk about walking according to the ways of the world and fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind. And then down in verse 11, Paul calls them Gentiles in the flesh. Now this is going to be really important to understand what it means to be in Christ, because just like Gentile is the opposite of what it means to be a Jew, so too does in the flesh mean the opposite of what it means to be in Christ. But now here's the most important thing. Being in the flesh turns out to be synonymous with being dead in trespasses and sin. Now because there's so much Jewish and now Christian theology packed into this idea, which is something that we talked about last time, Paul really needs to begin to unpack it for the Gentile Christians of his time so that they can understand exactly what he's talking about and why he's saying it. His world, it was largely Hellenized, and that is influenced, right, by the Greek culture. And even though Rome had taken over, Rome actually largely incorporated the Hellenistic culture into their paradigm, into their lifestyle. But the important thing to note is that this was a largely moralistic and works-driven worldview. And essentially, that basically translates to mean you do the good to get the good favor of your God. Our culture now, although it is largely secularized, it operates in much of the same way. You do the good to get the good. But Paul and Christianity has a very different idea of what it takes to and what it means to get the good. And to explain this idea, he wants to go back to the beginning and start with how we got the bad and how we got in the flesh in the first place. He does this best, I think, in Romans chapter 5, and particularly in verse 12, which says, "Through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all because of sin." Paul here, he is of course talking about Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, and he's talking about how they brought sin and death into the world. But there is a richness of theology and conceptual understanding that comes along with what Paul is intimately trying to communicate. The Jewish concept of death has always been one of separation. It was a separation of the soul from the body. But now, as Paul goes on, he's going to talk about a spiritual separation of self from God. So the foundation for why Paul was able to say in Ephesians that they were dead in sins while they were obviously still physically living is based on the fact that in that day that Adam and Eve sinned, they surely died as God had said, but yet they continued to physically live. And here's the connection. While Adam and Eve lived, they lived spiritually dead, in a state of relational separation from God, completely in the flesh, operating solely on their own works and in their own power, apart 100% from the Spirit of God. Now this is what he wants the Gentile Christians to understand about their life before Christ, that they were spiritually separated from God and living in their own works and in their own power, and ultimately this was their inheritance from Adam. Furthermore, there are at least two other conditions that Adam and Eve passed on to humanity, and we can see those in Genesis chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, and those are shame and guilt. Ashamed of their nakedness, they made leaf coverings, and afraid of God because of their guilt, they hid. These two things, covering our shame and hiding our guilt, they have persisted on in humanity precisely because they are natural results and responses to our sin and our spiritual death. We all hide the things about ourselves that we feel guilty for. We repress them and we deny them, and we all also try to cover the things up that we feel shameful for. We try to cover them by doing good works and moral acts to present our own goodness. Even those of us who have no desperately sinful history still move through life sensing that something is wrong, something is missing, and we still move through life separated from God, living on our own power, in our own works, on our own steam, trying to do the good to get the good. And this is exactly what it means to be walking according to the ways of the world. We walk separated from God. We walk in the flesh, continuously trying to cover our own shame and hide from our own guilt. We are dead in our trespasses and sin. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today. We started out with talking about what it meant to be dead in sin. Next time, we're going to discuss the topic of getting the good, which is going to lead us to talk about the theological concept of double imputation. If you like the content, go ahead and like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon so that you can get a notification as we post the next videos and move on through this series. I really appreciate you. God bless.